There are moments in history when the seemingly invincible are finally tested, when an unstoppable force meets an unexpected wall of resistance. The Mongol Empire, forged in the vast grasslands of Asia, had swept across continents like a storm, conquering everything in its path. They had defeated mighty kingdoms, burned great cities to the ground, and humbled empires that once seemed eternal. But in 1285, on the fields and mountains of Hungary, this fearsome war machine would encounter something it rarely faced: failure. This is the story of how Hungary, a nation once shattered by the Mongols, learned, adapted, and ultimately turned the tide against one of the most powerful armies the world had ever known. Imagine an army capable of traveling 100 miles in a single day, fighting in any condition, day or night, through the burning heat of summer or the freezing cold of winter, and outmaneuvering every opponent it faced. They knew their enemies' moves before the battle even began. Trained from birth, these soldiers were masters of both the bow and the horse. Their deadly recurve bows could strike targets from over 300 yards away. Agile and lightly armored, they lived off the land, retreating only to regroup and return stronger. This was the Mongol army. For nearly 2 centuries, no force on earth could rival them. They captured cities, crushed empires, and left entire regions in ashes. Yet even this unstoppable war machine would meet one of its most humbling defeats during the Second Mongol invasion of Hungary in 1285. How did a kingdom that had once been utterly devastated by Mongol power in 1241 manage to repel them just 4 decades later? It all began with geography. The Mongols had perfected their military strategies across the vast, open grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, where their speed and mobility gave them a decisive advantage. But Western Europe was an entirely different battlefield. The terrain was rugged, full of forests, rivers, and mountains that limited cavalry movement. Warfare here wasn't defined by enormous open-field clashes, but by smaller skirmishes, tactical maneuvers, and above all, sieges. From the 9th century onward, Western Europe had become a land of fortresses. Castles dotted the landscape, serving as both defensive strongholds and administrative centers. These fortifications were so effective that even when heavily outnumbered, European forces could hold their ground. During the Crusades, heavily fortified castles like Carrick, Montreal, and Croc de Chevaliers had withstood massive enemy assaults. While the Mongols were skilled in siege warfare, Western Europe presented a challenge unlike any they had faced before. The sheer number and strength of European castles meant that bypassing them was impossible for long-term conquest. Any Mongol forces that tried to avoid attacking castles would have been reduced to raiding rather than conquering. History confirms this pattern. In medieval Germany, when nomadic forces such as the Magyars attempted similar tactics centuries earlier, they eventually failed because defenders could always retreat behind thick stone walls, forcing besiegers to either starve or withdraw. Most people remember the Mongols' devastating victory in Hungary in 1241, but few recall their massive failure in 1285. To understand that outcome, we must first look back at the first invasion. In 1241, at the Battle of Mohi, a massive Mongol force crushed the Hungarian army and its allies. For over a year, the Mongols ravaged the land, burning towns, slaughtering civilians, and reducing Hungary to ruins. By the time they withdrew, nearly a quarter of the population had been killed, and countless settlements lay in ashes. King Béla IV of Hungary took this catastrophe as a harsh lesson. He realized that his kingdom's defenses were far too weak. At that time, Hungary had very few fortified cities. Most were made of wood and earth, which the Mongols easily destroyed with their siege engines. The country had only about 10 stone castles, mostly near the Austrian border. Determined to prevent such destruction from ever happening again, Béla IV began an ambitious program of fortification. By the end of his reign, nearly 100 new stone castles had been built across Hungary, a monumental transformation that redefined the kingdom's defensive strategy. Béla also recognized that his light cavalry forces were no match for the Mongols. Although a few heavily armored knights, particularly the Knights Templar, had performed better in close combat, Hungary needed a complete military overhaul. To achieve this, Béla created a new class of heavily armored knights modeled after Western European warriors. In 1247, he struck an agreement with the Knights of St. John, granting them land in southeastern Hungary in exchange for their assistance in training soldiers and building fortifications. The following year, he introduced a reform allowing members of the middle class to serve as knights if they joined the service of local barons, who, in turn, were required to provide well-equipped soldiers for the royal army. This reform fundamentally reshaped Hungary's social and military system. Within just a few years, landowners who supplied armored cavalry were elevated to noble status, forming a powerful new class loyal to the crown. Even foreign settlers who moved to Hungary were offered conditional nobility if they agreed to fight as mounted soldiers when needed. The results were astonishing. Hungary's military strength grew so significantly that foreign envoys took notice. One representative of King Charles I of Anjou wrote that the Hungarian royal house possessed immense power and that its army was so formidable that no nation in the east or north dared to challenge it. When the Hungarian king mobilized his forces, nearly every nearby country either submitted through kinship or through conquest. Beyond fortifications and knights, Béla IV also revitalized his kingdom through colonization. He invited settlers from Germany, Moravia, Poland, and Romania to repopulate the devastated lands. This wave of immigration boosted the economy, increased agricultural output, and strengthened Hungary's manpower. The new settlers not only rebuilt the nation's economy, but also formed a reliable reserve of soldiers ready to defend the realm. By the time the Mongols returned in 1285, they faced a completely different Hungary. This was no longer the shattered kingdom they had easily destroyed 4 decades earlier. It was fortified, organized, and prepared. And for the first time, the unstoppable Mongol war machine met its match. In the year 1259, King Béla IV of Hungary took a decisive step towards strengthening his kingdom's military defenses. Haunted by the devastation wrought by the Mongol invasion of 1241, he reached out to Pope Alexander IV, seeking assistance in establishing diplomatic contact with the Republic of Venice. His aim was clear and ambitious: to hire at least 1,000 Venetian crossbowmen. Venice, renowned across Europe for its long-standing military traditions, was not only a maritime power, but also home to some of the finest crossbowmen and infantry soldiers in the world. These professional troops had earned fame through centuries of naval and land-based warfare, combining discipline, skill, and innovative tactics. Béla IV recognized that Venice's highly trained soldiers could provide precisely what Hungary lacked: a professional, modernized force capable of countering the evolving threats from the east. His decision reflected a broader effort to rebuild and reform Hungary's military system after the catastrophic Mongol invasion, which had exposed the kingdom's weaknesses in mobility, coordination, and firepower. The Hungarian forces of 1241 were largely composed of feudal levies and lightly armed soldiers, ill-prepared to face the Mongols' superior organization and mobility. The few crossbows that had been used during that invasion had proven surprisingly effective, and Béla clearly understood that investing in such weaponry could make the difference in future conflicts. The Mongol withdrawal from Hungary in 1242 has long been a subject of debate among historians. Some have argued that the retreat was strategic, part of the Mongols' broader consolidation following the death of their great Khan, Ogdi, in late 1241. Others point to environmental factors. Hungary's central plains were notorious for their harsh winters, and during the early months of 1242, unseasonably cold and wet conditions turned vast stretches of the countryside into swampy, impassable terrain. The steppe-bred Mongol horses, accustomed to dry grasslands, found little pasture or solid ground to move across. Without sufficient food or mobility, The Mongols were forced to pull back toward the steppes of southern Russia, where conditions better suited their style of warfare. In the years that followed, the Mongol Empire began to fragment. After the deaths of Ogdi and Béla Khan, the once unified empire split into several khanates, each ruled semi-independently by different branches of Genghis Khan's descendants. One of these successor states was the Golden Horde, which came to dominate the western steppes, stretching from the Volga River to the borders of Eastern Europe. Internal power struggles weakened the central authority of the Mongol world, but they also produced ambitious leaders seeking to prove themselves through new campaigns. Among them was Nogai Khan, a powerful and charismatic general who emerged as one of the Golden Horde's most influential figures. Nogai never held the official title of Khan, but he effectively ruled the western regions of the Horde alongside his cousin, Khan Mengu. Known for his strategic brilliance and political acumen, Nogai wielded immense power and autonomy. Under his leadership, the Mongols launched renewed military expeditions into Europe, seeking to expand their influence and maintain dominance over their vassal states. One of his most promising commanders was Talabuga, a young Mongol prince who distinguished himself in the 1258-1259 campaign against Lithuania. After the Lithuanian campaign, Nogai and Talabuga turned their attention to Poland. In 1287, they invaded the region, plundering cities, enslaving thousands, and spreading terror throughout Eastern Europe. Historical sources suggest that approximately 10,000 Poles were captured during these raids. Buoyed by their success and aware of Hungary's internal instability, Nogai and Talabuga began to consider another invasion, this time a renewed assault on the Kingdom of Hungary. The timing seemed ideal. Since the death of King Béla IV, Hungary had descended into political chaos. His son, Stephen V, had ruled only briefly before dying in 1272, leaving the throne to his young son, Ladislaus IV. Known as Ladislaus the Cuman, he inherited not only a troubled kingdom, but also a divided society. His mother, Queen Elizabeth, was of Cuman origin, a Turkic nomadic people who had fled westward to escape the Mongols and were granted asylum in Hungary during Béla IV's reign. While the Cumans had proven useful as cavalry and scouts, their cultural differences with the native Hungarians sparked deep resentment and mistrust. Ladislaus' reign was defined by his reliance on the Cumans, both politically and militarily. He surrounded himself with Cuman advisors and soldiers, alienating much of the Hungarian nobility, who saw the Cumans as outsiders and rivals. Tensions reached their peak in 1282 when a large-scale rebellion erupted between the Cumans and Hungarian nobles. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but its aftermath left deep wounds. Many Cumans fled Hungary, offering their services to Nogai Khan and revealing to him the full extent of Hungary's internal discord. They described a kingdom plagued by feuding barons, a weakened monarchy, and widespread disunity, a perfect opportunity for invasion. In 1285, nearly 15 years after the death of Béla Khan, Nogai Khan and Talabuga launched what became known as the Second Mongol Invasion of Hungary. It was in many ways a grim sequel to the horrors of 1241. Their plan followed the traditional Mongol strategy of dividing their army into multiple fast-moving columns to confuse and overwhelm the enemy. Nogai led his forces through Transylvania, attacking from the east, while Talabuga advanced through Transcarpathia and Moravia, approaching from the north. A smaller detachment pushed directly toward the Hungarian heartlands, mirroring the route taken by Khadan during the first invasion. This complex maneuver mirrored the Mongols' earlier campaigns under Genghis Khan, particularly during the conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire, where multiple smaller forces had advanced along different routes to create the illusion of a much larger army. The tactic worked by spreading confusion and forcing defenders to divide their forces. The Mongols also relied on an extensive intelligence network, gathering information about geography, local politics, and enemy troop movements. In previous campaigns against the Song dynasty in China, they had even used river routes for rapid transport, striking with devastating precision. The 1285 invasion was timed for winter, a season when most European armies were unprepared for combat. The Mongols sought to catch the Hungarians completely off guard before King Ladislaus IV could rally his nobles and assemble a united defense. Their objective was not to engage in a single, decisive battle, but to weaken Hungary through relentless speed, surprise, and terror, dismantling its defenses piece by piece. Unlike the first invasion, this time the Mongols faced fewer distractions. The Golden Horde was stable, and no guy could commit a large force to the campaign. Although medieval chroniclers exaggerated the Mongol army's size, claiming numbers as high as 200,000, modern historians estimate the invasion force at around 30,000 to 50,000 men. This army included elite cavalry units, archers, and contingents from allied vassal states such as the Ruthenians, who added considerable strength to the invasion. The Mongol warriors of 1285 were equipped much as their predecessors had been, wearing chain or scale armor that balanced protection with agility. Their steel helmets often featured reinforced face guards and neck flaps. The Mongols' most iconic weapon, the composite bow, remained their deadliest tool, capable of firing arrows with incredible power and accuracy, even from horseback. In close combat, they wielded curved sabers, lances, maces, and axes, weapons designed for both speed and impact. As the Mongol horsemen swept once more into the Carpathian Basin, Hungary faced its darkest hour yet. The kingdom's internal divisions, rebellious barons, and foreign dependencies had left it politically fractured and militarily vulnerable. The Mongols were returning not just as invaders, but as predators sensing weakness. What followed would test the very survival of Hungary, a kingdom still haunted by the memory of the first invasion and now standing once again on the brink of destruction. During the second Mongol invasion of Hungary in 1285, the balance of power in Eastern Europe once again hung by a thread. The Mongol Empire, led by the ambitious commander Talabuga, had returned to finish what Béla Khan and Subutai had begun in 1241. But this time, the Hungarians were no longer the same vulnerable kingdom they had been 4 decades earlier. Under the leadership of King Ladislaus IV, Hungary had rebuilt its defenses, strengthened its fortifications, and learned invaluable lessons from the devastating first invasion. The Hungarians could muster an estimated 30,000 soldiers, a mixture of royal troops and local forces that included Saxons, Vlachs, and various border defenders. This army, though modest compared to the vast Mongol hordes of the East, was well organized and strategically distributed. They had mobilized swiftly to resist the invasion and, crucially, to defend the fortified castles that dotted the countryside. As Talabuga led the main Mongol army westward through the Carpathian Mountains, his campaign immediately ran into trouble. The Mongols had expected another lightning conquest across open plains, where their cavalry could dominate. Instead, they encountered brutal winter conditions. Heavy snowstorms battered their columns in the Carpathians, turning mountain passes into deadly traps. Horses collapsed, supplies dwindled, and morale plummeted. The weather alone became their first enemy, but the deeper threat lay in the Hungarian strategy. This time, the Hungarians had deliberately employed scorched earth tactics. Learning from their catastrophic defeat in 1241, villages were evacuated well in advance, and peasants carried their livestock and grain into heavily fortified castles. The Mongols, who relied heavily on looting and plundering local resources to sustain their armies, found only empty homes, burned fields, and deserted towns. They were starving before they even reached their primary targets. Contemporary chronicles from Poland and Galicia described the Mongol army losing thousands of men and horses to hunger and cold during their march through northern Hungary. By the time Talabuga's forces reached Pest, they discovered it completely abandoned. The inhabitants had already taken refuge behind stone walls in nearby castles. Meanwhile, Queen Elizabeth's entourage refused to stay idle. From the walls of Buda, they launched bold counterattacks, harassing the Mongol detachments and cutting off their scouts. These localized acts of defiance were small, but symbolically powerful. They showed that Hungary was no longer terrified of the Mongol name. The decisive confrontation unfolded in western Transylvania. Here, the weakened Mongol forces met the Royal Hungarian army, personally led by King Ladislaus IV. Unlike the Mongols' first invasion, the Hungarians were ready and disciplined. The kingdom had reformed its military structure in the intervening decades, adopting Western European styles of warfare that emphasized heavily armored knights and improved coordination between cavalry and infantry. Though Hungary's army was not massive, its core was composed of elite knights equipped with chainmail hauberks, iron helmets, long swords, and heavy lances. They were supported by infantry wielding pikes, spears, and crossbows, ideal for repelling mounted attacks. The Mongols, masters of mobility and archery, launched their traditional hit-and-run assaults, hoping to lure the Hungarians into open ground. But this time it didn't work. The Hungarian knights held firm, refusing to break formation. When the moment was right, they launched a sudden and well-timed countercharge. The heavily armored knights slammed into the Mongol lines with devastating force. The Mongols' light cavalry, designed for speed and flexibility, could not withstand the sheer weight and discipline of the Hungarian formation. Their arrows glanced off armor, and their horses panicked under the thunder of armored lances. The result was chaos. The Mongols, unaccustomed to prolonged close combat, found themselves overwhelmed. Their formation broke, and Talabuga ordered a retreat to avoid complete annihilation. But as the battered Mongols withdrew through the mountain passes of the Carpathians, disaster struck again. The Cumans, who had once fought alongside the Mongols but now served as Hungarian allies, ambushed them. Using fast-moving light cavalry, ironically the same tactic that had made the Mongols so feared, they trapped and slaughtered much of the retreating force. According to later accounts, Talabuga returned to Mongol territory with nothing but his wife and a single horse. While that detail is almost certainly an exaggeration, it underscores how catastrophic the campaign had been. At the same time, another Mongol commander, Nogai Khan, was operating in Transylvania. His forces continued to raid towns such as Regin, Brashov, and Bystritsa, burning villages and looting supplies. Yet, just like Talabuga, he met fierce resistance. The Hungarian fortresses constructed and reinforced after 1241 proved impregnable. The Mongols lacked the advanced siege equipment necessary to capture stone castles, and their forces suffered heavily from hunger and attrition. When King Ladislaus IV marched to confront Nogai Khan's army, he found that local forces under the command of Roland Borsa had already inflicted devastating losses on the Mongols. By the time the king's army arrived, the battle was nearly over. Nogai's troops were scattered, and only a few stragglers escaped eastward. The remnants of the Mongol forces retreated from Hungary in defeat, marking the end of the second invasion. Hungary had survived once again, but the victory came at a political cost. King Ladislaus IV, known for his alliance with the Cumans, was accused by nobles of inviting the Mongols into the kingdom or failing to act decisively against them. While these accusations were largely unfounded, they weakened his authority. The true defenders of Hungary had been its regional lords and barons, whose local militias and fortresses had borne the brunt of the fighting. As a result, these nobles emerged stronger and more autonomous, while royal power diminished. For the Mongols, the defeat marked a turning point. Their influence in Central Europe began to fade. They no longer possessed the manpower or organization to launch another large-scale invasion west of the Carpathians. While the Golden Horde continued smaller raids into Poland and Hungary during the following decades, these were mere shadows of their former might. Interestingly, while the Mongol Empire's branches in China and the Middle East evolved, adopting new technologies, siege tactics, and administrative systems, the Golden Horde remained locked in its old ways. In China, Kublai Khan's armies had integrated advanced Chinese engineering, while in Persia, Hulagu Khan employed some of the most skilled siege engineers of the age. The Golden Horde, by contrast, continued to rely on traditional steppe warfare, fast horse archers, minimal siege capability, and a dependence on mobility. This stagnation eventually made them vulnerable to more adaptive and fortified European powers. By the mid-14th century, the tide had fully turned. In 1345, Hungarian forces led by Count Andrew Lodge even invaded Mongol territory, defeating a Golden Horde army and capturing what would later become Moldavia. The hunters had become the hunted. Looking back, the second Mongol invasion of Hungary stands as a defining moment in medieval European history, a story of adaptation and resilience. Hungary's survival demonstrated that even the most fearsome army in the world could be defeated through preparation, fortification, and unity. The Mongols, unmatched for decades, had finally met an enemy who learned from the past. But history always leaves us with haunting questions. What if the Hungarians hadn't fortified their castles? What if the Cumans hadn't joined their cause? What if Europe had fallen to Mongol rule once more? The entire political and cultural landscape of the continent might have been reshaped under Mongol dominance. This was history's narrow escape, a moment when the fate of Europe hung by a thread, and a small kingdom on the frontier stood its ground against the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. Join us next time as we journey deeper into the forgotten chapters of history, where courage, strategy, and chance determine the destiny of nations. Don't forget to subscribe and continue exploring the stories that shaped our world.